good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to everyone who's joined. Thank you very much, Sebastian, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining this webinar today. My name is Jamie Hannaford, and I am a group leader of the Hydrological Status and Outlooks group at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be talking about an initiative called the Robin Initiative that, has briefly been mentioned, is all about trying to establish a network for global hydrological climate change detection. Now, I've been working here at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology for over 22 years and working with hydrological observations that whole time. I began my career working in the UK National River Flow Archive, our main database here in the UK of hydrological observations. My work over the years has taken me to working on hydrological observations in many other countries. And I'm really privileged to be talking to you today about a global initiative to bring together hydrological observations for the community. So I'm going to jump right in now. Before I do, though, on the slide here, it says this is Jamie Hannaford and the Robin team. I just wanted to qualify what I mean by that. So first of all, I'd like to just thank all of the other team members from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology who are listed on here. These are the people working with me on Robin from this organisation, but there are many other people, 54 people from 27 other countries, and they'll be acknowledged at the end as well. So this really is a community and collaborative endeavour. I'll just briefly, before I'm going to show this slide again later and add a bit more detail, but right now I just wanted to say briefly, what is Robin? Because that's the title of this presentation. Well, Robin is to advance a global reference hydrometric network. So this is a network that's dedicated towards the idea of trying to detect climate-driven changes on hydrological systems. Now, I'll unpack all of this in a moment. I just thought I'd show you very much at the start that this is all about a global network of hydrological observations. What I'm going to actually do now is then go into more detail about what we actually mean by reference networks and what we mean by the Robin network in bringing this together. So here is an outline for my talk today. I'm going to be talking really four parts to this talk. First of all, I'm going to give a brief background to the challenge, what we're trying to address, the question of detecting climate-driven changes in floods and droughts. I'm going to explain what a reference network is and give a bit of a history of their development internationally. I'm then going to introduce this new global Robin initiative and our plans. I'm not really going to be talking much about the analysis of this data, mainly because I think when Bastian asked me to do this presentation many months ago, I thought we'd have finished our analysis now. But as you can imagine, with all these kind of things, it takes longer to get data together than it does to analyze them. So I'm not going to be talking much about analysis. This is more about the history of this initiative, why it's important, and also, crucially, the last bullet point, how you can get involved in the Robin network going forwards. So they're the various components I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to start off with a bit of background to the central issues, the motivation, if you like, what we're trying to why we're trying to advance this network, Robin. Now, I'm sure that I'm preaching to the converted when it comes to underscoring the importance of understanding the risk to hydrological extremes, to floods and droughts. I think it's always good to start with a recent example of a hydrological extreme, though. So I've picked an example from Europe in September, the catastrophic flooding caused by the Mediterranean storm Daniel as it progressed across the Mediterranean. Truly catastrophic flooding across large areas of southern Europe, Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey. And of course, you will have all seen the absolutely tragic loss of life in Libya, the still as yet unknown impact in terms of human loss of that flood event. So this is an example of a really extreme flood event that we've seen in the very recent past. And of course, you could pick on many other examples from 2023. You don't have to go too far back, though, to see the other extreme. I took both of these photos here in November last year. Low reservoir levels in England and also in northern Spain. So we saw last year one of the most severe drought events in recent decades in the UK, and that was part of a European-wide drought. Again, one of the most severe drought events on record for many areas of the continent. You can see here some of the examples of the drought status across the whole of Europe in the summer of last year. Really extreme drought event that was still manifesting itself in impacts in the autumn and in some areas into this year. So these and then a number of other extreme events underlie the potential impact of extreme rainfall and rainfall deficits that underlie our continuing vulnerability to floods and droughts. And of course, such events inevitably prompt the question as to the role of anthropogenic warming in driving these events, for very good reason. The central challenge for anyone concerned with flood and drought risk management and adaptation is to understand to what extent these events are part of an emerging trend fueled by anthropogenic warming, and crucially, how those risks will change in future in a warming world. And of course, one of the challenges with this is that when you look at hydrological and climate models going into the future, we certainly see and we expect there to be huge changes in flood and drought risk in many, if not most, areas of the world going forwards. However, it can be very challenging to really understand what that means. Now, I could have picked any number of studies to illustrate this. There's so many studies that come out all the time looking at global flood and drought risk. I've chosen this study. It's actually nearly a decade old, a UKCEH-led study by my colleague Christelle Prudhomme. And why it's a really nice example is that the map here is showing effectively the headline of this study is that there is increasing drought in many areas of the globe, increasing hydrological droughts with certain hotspots like around the Mediterranean, but a huge range of uncertainties. All of these plots on the right-hand side are showing the difference in future droughts according to different climate model inputs and different hydrological model inputs. And so you see there's a huge range of variation in how droughts may unfold globally going forwards. And this is really the central challenge for policymakers, if you like, that they live in an environment where through climate projections, we have very, very deep uncertainties as a result of these very wide ranges of probable outcomes. So there's really a challenge to understand how risk will evolve going into the future. We effectively need to try and detect any emerging trends in floods and droughts to help us try and put these projections in context and try and constrain what those projections are showing us in terms of what the observations are telling us in the recent past. And that's where hydrological observations come in. So as I say, I've been working with hydrological observations for over 20 years. This is an example of a gauging station in the UK. I'm going to be talking today mainly about river flows, but of course the same kind of principles apply for all sorts of other hydrological observations as well. We need hydrological observations over time. They can build up very long time series. We're lucky in the UK to have many records of 40, 50 years plus, where we can start to ask these questions. Are floods and droughts increasing? Do we see trends towards more flooding and droughts or not? And this really brings us right back to the core challenge that Robin is trying to address. So on an individual country scale, it can be very challenging to ask whether floods and droughts, whether there is statistical evidence for them increasing. Globally, it's even harder. The IPCC statements that have come out, like the 6th assessment report, for example, are often very guarded in the statements they make about whether or not you can identify observational trends in floods or droughts. From the last report, which incidentally was probably the most, probably one of the more confident ones relative to previous assessment reports, here's a few statements in there that exemplify the fact that we actually are really unsure as to whether there is much evidence of observational flooding and droughts changes on the ground. So, for example, confidence in peak flow trends is low. The second example, this lack of confidence is often due to there being model uncertainties, a lack of studies overall, and crucially the role of anthropogenic influences. And that's what I'll be talking about for most of my talk. So as a result, again, there is low confidence in being able to attribute changes to floods. And the final one about droughts, very difficult to assess historical trends in a hydrological drought due to a limited availability of data sets. So this really is kind of what we're trying to get to the grips with Robin, that these global assessments of flood and drought trends often are unable to make very confident assertions of whether or not floods and droughts are really changing or not. You might ask the question, well, why is that? It's kind of highlighted here in these bits, these blue bits, and lack of data sets and the key role of anthropogenic disturbances. And I'm just going to talk about why they're a challenge in a moment. One of the key ones, of course, is the role of human disturbances on river flow regimes. This picture on the right is from a gauging station in Wales, and you can see it's just downstream of a dam. So, of course, this gauging station is going to be very modified by the impacts of the reservoir in the catchment. And the picture on the left is from a paper a few years ago, looking at the proportion of the global land surface where reservoirs have a huge impact on, so effectively storage and are therefore having an influence on the outflows from these catchments. So this is the first point to make really about the challenges, is that anthropogenic impacts on stream flow regimes are really pervasive and have big impacts all over the global land surface, which makes it really, really challenging to try and identify climate-driven trends. And here is an example, a cautionary tale, if you like. This is from the River Thames in the UK, an iconic river, our longest river flow record going back to the 1880s. And what you can see, this graph is showing a downward trend in low flows over that very long period of record. That's actually a statistically significant trend. You might look at that low flow trend and think this is evidence of there being a decrease in low flows, maybe droughts becoming more severe. However, the reality is that this trend is driven entirely by water consumption. We're very lucky with this river, as well as having a very long record back to the 1880s. We have a long record of all of the withdrawals of water, and we can naturalize this series, so we can actually account for the human disturbances on the flow regime. And all I want you to look at on the screen is that, but if you look at the naturalized series, the river flow trend actually goes in the opposite direction. So the point here is that human impacts, in this case, it's abstractions, taking water out for the growth of London through the 20th century, that can obscure or even reverse natural changes in river flows. So this is a really cautionary tale that you can't just look at trends in any series and conclude that there are climate-driven trends operating. You need to be really careful about the river flows that you choose to analyse. As an incidental point to make as well, the seemingly big upward trend in naturalised flows is also spurious, because many of the early parts of this record are very also dubious due to changing hydrometric practices. And that's the second big challenge I wanted to highlight, is that hydrometric data quality can be a really big barrier. So measuring river flows is a challenge even at the best of times, but measuring floods or high flows is even more challenging. This is a picture of a gauging station under normal conditions. It's a very well constrained structure in southern England. If you look at it during higher flow conditions, you can see that the weir is barely operating as a weir, and under even higher flows, it's being bypassed by non-measured flows. So you get these kind of issues where here is a hydrograph from this site where you can see that the flows have been truncated. So they're simply not measured for the bigger flows because they're uncaptured. You might think low flows are much easier because you have a small trickle of water, but actually measuring low flows can be really challenging because measuring low velocities can be very, very difficult, even with structures. And small errors in the stage, in the level of the river, can propagate through to really big errors in flow. So, for example, these people here are cleaning weirs that have got weed growth on them, and that can be a really big impact on low flows too. So I just wanted to pause and say that these questions of hydrological data are really, really important and underpin a lot of what we're trying to do within Robin. If you're interested in the questions of hydrological data quality, there's a couple of resources here. The one on the left is a brand new textbook that many people in Eurofriend have been involved in, and this has just literally come out in the last month or so. A primer, a textbook on hydrological drought, and within it, I led a chapter on hydrological data. And there's a nice example here. This is not a real river. This is a river that we've corrupted with lots of examples of the kinds of errors that you get, missing data, dropouts, weed growth, and so on. So this kind of chapter gives a good example of some of the issues you face with hydrological data. The one on the right is also a paper by Rob Wilby and others that highlights some of those challenges. So this is a really good resource if you're interested in some of these issues. But I'm now going to get back towards the justification for reference networks, having set out some of the challenges. But I'll finish this bit with saying, this is a quote I've stolen from one of my, a guy who's retired from CEH now, but who I think was always the font of all knowledge when it comes to hydrometry and hydrological data. And he'd always say, why is hydrometry like skydiving? And the answer to that question is that getting it right 99% of the time is not enough. The point is, of course, is that you can be measuring good quality flows for nearly the whole range, but if you're not getting those really extreme values at low flows and high flows, they're the bits that we really need to be monitoring to understand whether floods and droughts are actually changing or not under hydrological variability. And so, moving on to the next part of this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we start to overcome some of these challenges. So I've explained to you the motivation that we want to understand floods and droughts and how they respond to hydrological variability and anthropogenic warming. I've also explained the pitfalls and challenges in relation to data quality and human impacts on flow regimes. So what do we do about it? Well, this is where reference hydrometric networks come in. The aim of reference hydrometric networks are to try and filter out the effect of human influences on stream flow and focus on those catchments with near natural regimes. By doing this, we can actually try and understand hydrological changes that are driven by climate variations and anthropogenic warming. This picture you can see is an example of the UK benchmark network, which is a reference hydrometric network we established in the early 2000s. The benchmark network has now been used in many, many studies. We wrote a few papers looking at trends in the benchmark network, but it's since been used by many, many others in the research community. So reference networks really trying to establish networks that allow us to detect climate-driven changes. And I'll talk a bit more about reference networks as we go through. I'd just like to qualify what we're not talking about, though. We're not necessarily talking about experimental catchments. Now, I only put this point on here because after I gave a similar presentation in Paris earlier on this year, I had a lot of people asking me questions and talking to me in a way that I think was because they assumed I was talking about upland experimental catchments designed specifically and installed for a particular purpose. We're not talking about those. We're actually talking about using gauging stations that are part of existing regional or national networks. We're talking about subsets of those networks, not new infrastructure. Having said that, experimental catchments are important and they can indeed be part of reference networks, and they are part of many of the networks you'll see in a moment. But we're not talking specifically about new experimental catchments, rather finding catchments that are out there already in gauging networks and trying to find catchments that meet this criteria of being near natural and having good quality data. So what makes a good reference catchment? Well, ideally, sensibly natural, free of major human disturbances, good quality data, ideally across the whole flow regime, and long records. So 40, 50-year records are obviously good, but the longer the better. That sounds really simple, doesn't it? And of course, all of these are easier said than done. And you can challenge each of these particular areas. There's so many different facets to what we mean by natural regimes and good quality data. It becomes really difficult to actually pin this down, especially when you look internationally. And I'll come back to this issue many times in this talk. But there are plenty of examples out there of reference networks. So here are some. The Canadian and US reference networks have been going since the 1990s. So the US and Canada were really leading the way on this kind of initiative. But since then, there have been reference networks in Ireland, in France, in Australia. These are networks that we've been aware of for a long time, and we've bought into the Robin initiative, as you'll see soon. And here's a couple of examples of some reference networks we've only discovered since we've been working on Robin. So Poland and Vietnam have reference networks, and we've reached out and now brought these networks into this Robin initiative. But at this stage, before I talk about Robin in any more detail, I just want to highlight that there are reference networks that have been around a while, and there are many different reference networks that are used at a national basis. So the idea of trying to establish reference networks and bring them together internationally has quite a long history. back in 2010, myself and Terry Marsh, who I've mentioned already, we attended a conference in Canada representing the UK, but it was a special session about these reference networks led by the Canadians and Americans, who, as I say, were really the pioneers in this area. And following that conference, there's 2 papers that were written up. And these, if anyone's interested in this topic of reference networks, these 2 papers are a really valuable resource. But this quote you can see on screen is from one of those papers. And it's just something we wrote at the time, literally back in 2011. We wrote this statement, which was that with international cooperation and leadership, an established and documented international reference network data set would exist that could serve as the basis for information on historical trends for future IPCC reports. So as I said earlier, IPCC reports are generally quite weak in what they say about hydrological change, especially in relation to compared to other geophysical domains like the cryosphere. In writing this paragraph, we were sort of saying we really need an international initiative to bring these kind of reference networks together. And in effect, with Robin, that's what we now have. And I'll talk about Robin in a moment, and we'll really sort of say why we're trying to address this challenge we raised some years ago. There have already been some efforts before Robin, though, in the last decade to actually go. Having had that meeting in Quebec, having established a vision, we then started to work together on bringing reference networks together. So, for example, here's one catchment in the UK. It's part of our benchmark network. This then fed into a European-wide analysis led by Kirsten Stahl in Freiburg, and many other people in the Eurofriend network were part of this analysis. So this was an effort to go from national reference networks to an international continental scale assessment of hydrological change in undisturbed catchments. Following this, Kirsten and many of those other European researchers collaborated with the US and Canadian researchers to pull together a transcontinental analysis of reference network catchments for the very first time. I think it's worth just pausing briefly on this, because this was a big step in going from national to continental and beyond. Why that's so important is that one of the other reasons why the IPCC statements are often so are often weak is that not only are there barriers like anthropogenic influences, data quality, and so on, but there are many different national and regional scale studies that are done with different methodologies, bringing it together into a truly consistent trend analysis at large scales has always been really difficult. And so hence the benefit of this kind of work is that you apply the same consistent trend analysis methodologies over a large domain. And what did this study find? Well, there's an example on the screen showing these reference networks across North America and Europe. We effectively looked at the trends in large floods, so 25, 50 or 100-year return period floods. And we looked at categorizing these catchments into different groups according to the Köppen-Geiger climate type and according to catchment size. What you can actually see, and this is a complex plot, and I'm not going to go into any real detail, but the reds are showing sort of bigger increases in flooding, but only those with a yellow square around have a significant increase. So it's actually very few of these regions show a significant increase in flooding. It's only really 1 or 2 regions, one region in Europe, and for one flood magnitude, the 50-year return period flood, where we saw a very significant increase. And I think that's important because it just goes back to what we said at the start, that we know that climate change will affect flow regimes in the future, but actually detecting it at an observational scale and in observational records is often very difficult, and you don't always find very compelling trends. Having said that, one of the interesting things this study showed is the importance of large-scale atmospheric and oceanic circulation mechanisms. I'm not going to read this quote out, but effectively it's a really nice kind of summary of how we found that, in effect, the number of significant trends in major floods across North America and Europe was actually very low, but the amount of trends that could be, or the amount of variation that could be associated with the AMO, which is one of the main sort of slowly varying mechanisms of low frequency variability for the whole of in the Northern Hemisphere, you actually see some really quite interesting parallels between variations in the AMO and the occurrence of major flooding in both Europe and in North America. One of the other steps on the road to Robin was that we've gone, having established this transatlantic scale collaboration, we began to reach out to other reference networks. So through work led by Glenn Hodgkins, again, USGS partners, this follow-up work to that study on floods has been looking also at bringing in Australia and Brazil. And this is some work that's actually in revision at the moment in water resources research. We're hoping it's very close to getting over the finishing line. And I won't talk really in any detail about the results in this, but one of the things I did want to highlight is that going to an even bigger part of the global land surface brings even more challenges in terms of different regimes and different types of geography and climate. Even in Europe, of course, we have, when you look at low flows, there are many different low flow regimes ranging here from the high Alps through temperate environments like the UK through to ephemeral, almost semi-arid ephemeral catchments in Spain. And this can be a real challenge. Once you go beyond national scale to big scales on a continental scale, you bring so many different flow regimes into the mix, it can be really hard to actually design analysis and interpret the outputs. There's just one example here of one of the plots from the paper for a particular region of perennial catchments, sort of cold region perennial catchments, and again showing no increase in extreme low flows, in fact showing a decrease in the probability of extreme low flows over this period of record. But it's a whole nother story, and I'm sure Glenn will be telling that story in other forums going forward. So I just wanted to highlight that as an example of how there's been, in summary for this part of the presentation, there have been national reference network initiatives, some efforts to bring them all together across on a continental scale, and increasingly this has all been pointing towards the direction of trying to go global. And so this really is where we come in with Robin. So I'm going to repeat the slide that I mentioned right at the start. This is the vision of Robin. Some countries have reference networks to help detect climate change impacts on hydrology. There have been no efforts to really integrate these globally. And so within Robin, we're advancing an effort to bring together a global reference network so that we can have consistent definitions of what a reference network is, consistent analysis on a truly global level. And this statement, again, the vision of this is that, going right back to our ambition from Quebec in 2010, future IPCC assessments will be able to make more confident appraisals of changes in floods and droughts. And this ultimately will underpin improved adaptation. So it's quite a big ambition. So what are the objectives of Robin? Well, it's to establish a long-term collaboration of international experts to develop global capacity for establishing and sustaining reference networks. It's crucially about sharing best practice and skills. There's lots of different networks out there and lots of knowledge, and it's about trying to bring all of that knowledge together to develop common standards, protocols, and tools for data sharing and data analysis. We actually do want to establish a readily and freely available reference network dataset, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and also code libraries that go with it to allow the user community to analyze these data very easily, and advance climate change detection studies to support that central ambition of improving trend assessments for the IPCC and similar initiatives. And the final bullet point here, though, is that although Robin's more about the people network and the data network and getting a data set together, we are going to be analysing those data sets within Robin and publishing trend analyses ourselves. So there's a number of components. Work package 1 and 2 have already been done. We've built the network, we've collated the data, and we're right in the middle of analysing that data at the moment and informing the rest of the world. That's kind of what I'm doing now, I guess. I should just acknowledge the funding for this. So Robin was funded through a relatively small grant from our Global Seed Corn Partnerships Fund from our UK Natural Environment Research Council, and we have long-term funding from CEH to keep this going for a good few more years hence. So where are we with Robin? How is the Robin network going? Well, you can see from this map here that this is the current set of countries that are part of the Robin initiative. We have many of the actors who have been involved in previous studies from Europe, North America, but also, as well as Australia and Brazil that we had been liaising with previously, we've brought in New Zealand and Chile and various parts of Africa as well. So there has been a lot of work already to try and bring as many countries into Robin, but as I will say multiple times in the last sort of 10 minutes of this presentation, it's all about trying to get more countries involved. And so we're trying to get and mobilize as many different organizations to be part of Robin as possible. There are a number of supporting organizations, as you can see here, they'll be mentioned several times, but we have support from UNESCO and the WMO to try and keep this initiative going forwards, as well as the IPCC and Caravan, who I will mention specifically in a moment. And so here is the story so far. We have data from 3,000 gauging stations in 27 countries. One thing that does stand out clearly is that there are many gaps, huge white spaces, especially in Asia, in large parts of Africa, and still, even despite some good coverage in South America, still many white spaces. So there is a long, long way to go towards something truly global. But I don't want to say that in a negative way, because there's been so much goodwill and effort to actually get this network going as it is, that I think we need to celebrate this as an achievement and as a stepping stone, even though there remain large areas of white space on the global land surface. I should just say as well, before talking a bit more about the data set and what we're doing with it, we have been working, I mentioned so much early on in the early part of this talk about data quality being a barrier. So we've been really focused on quality control. Obviously, there's been a quality control through having a common understanding of what we mean by good quality data and free of artificial influences. But at the same time, there are inevitably going to be errors that slip through any process. So we've been running a centralized manual QC process to try and look for any anomalies and errors. And there are some examples here of dropouts and infield sequences that don't look realistic. There are some step changes and so on. So we've picked up on a number of different issues. We don't have enough resource to try and go right the way back to data providers and resolve everything. So we've generally been removing anomalous sequences or changing the start and end dates of records to preserve as much data as we can. And so we're zeroing in on being able to release the Robin dataset relatively soon. We're currently developing a dataset for a data center with a digital object identifier that's going to be minted in the environmental information data center, so that there will be a long-term repository for this freely available data. We're also writing a data paper that we're aiming at a special issue for submission in December of 2023. I should highlight as well, though, that when we say about data access, I'm sure many people will already be asking questions around, how do we manage to do that on a global level? Because some streamflow data is not shared outside of countries. So we have an approach for that within Robin. Effectively, there are 3 different levels where some data, where it's allowed to be shared globally, that will all be available in the open data set for anyone to use. The second category is where people have to be signed up to the Robin network to use the data, that it can only be shared within the network. And then the final category is where data is not allowed to be shared, can't leave the country at all. You may have noticed earlier on when I showed the map of the world, in fact, I might just skip back and just show there are some countries highlighted here in Japan and Japan and Vietnam, where the raw data is not able to be shared. But what we're doing is sharing code libraries to now allow indicators to be extracted that can be shared globally within the community. So there's various ways and means that we can make sure that some level of data accessibility is available on a global level. The final point here as well is that all of the Robin partners are co-authors, and it's really important to emphasize this is not about just gathering data. This is gathering a network of people, a network of institutions to go with that data, and all of the Robin partners are co-authors in this data set and data papers and everything we produce from it. Just a couple of examples of summary statistics about the data set. So I won't dwell on these, but we've got a reasonably good range of catchment sizes, some biased towards smaller catchments inevitably, for which you always get with reference networks. Pleasing to see, again, part of the criteria for defining these networks, that generally, they are largely complete. And again, and it's somewhat surprising in a way, once you go to a global level, there are actually a good number of records in this data set that have 30, 40, 50 years plus of hydrometric data availability, which is really beneficial for trend analysis. We've actually put those into some bins here. These are bins that we've used in our previous work with Glenn Hodgkins from the USGS. And you can see here again, there is a sort of slight bias towards what we might call medium-sized catchments, 100 to 999 kilometers square on here. But generally some good sampling, even with some larger catchments too. I mentioned the question of intermittency earlier on, and inevitably once you go global, you do end up with having many catchments that are ephemeral and strongly ephemeral. And so there is a need to actually factor in this kind of property when analysing these data on a global level. So this is also looking at another way of stratifying the data. We've looked at the extent to which we're sampling the different Köppen Geiger climate zones and also the hydro belts that have been quite widely used as a way of categorizing the land surface for hydrology following this Maybeck et al. Paper. And again, actually, there is a bias in the in both Köppen Geiger and the hydro belts towards some of the more temperate parts of the world, but at the same time, a reasonably good sampling of the global land surface and its properties. But again, as I said earlier, we have many white spaces, and this is a stepping stone towards hopefully much more of a coverage of that map in future iterations. And in the last bit of this talk, which I'm coming to in a moment, we'll talk about what that future vision for Robin is. I just wanted to highlight that we're also collaborating with another international initiative called Caravan. Many people might be aware of this, but Caravan is an effort to bring together a different kind of global data set. In effect, it's using the CAMLs, large sample hydrology data sets, which exist in many countries around the world. The Caravan is already pulling together these CAMLs large sample data sets for the global community. So what's the difference with CAMLs? Well, with the Caravan data set, Caravan includes all sorts of stations, including heavily influenced catchments. So they're not just looking at near natural catchments like Robin is, but of course you need to look at those influenced catchments as well. They're worthy of study in and of themselves. What do we have in common with Caravan? Well, first of all, we're working with Caravan. So Caravan members of the team have joined Robin to help us with extracting global metadata sets in a consistent way. This is one of the nice things about Caravan. It's using all sorts of globally available data sets like HydroAtlas and ERA 5 land to essentially be able to generate global data sets of catchment attributes like land cover, soils, and climate attributes. It uses these approaches to generate globally consistent data sets. And that's going to be really important for us in Robin as we're looking at a global scale. And so Robin and Caravan together, I think, is a really powerful combination, because Robin is looking at near natural catchments, which are a subset within the wider set of catchments that Caravan is looking at that include many disturbed sites. Just to finish on what Robin is doing before I tell you how you can get involved, we are also working on a global analysis at the moment within Robin. So we're putting this data set out there for anyone to analyse, but we are analysing it ourselves. We're focusing on a couple of different dimensions, one of which is looking at annual and monthly streamflow trends on a global scale. And this, in some ways, there's been some work looking at this, an example here from a European study, looking at monthly streamflow variability. And we're also looking at drought events, so defined in terms of using the threshold level method as a way of identifying droughts, their beginning, their end, their duration, and their severity. And again, in this way, we're following on from some other studies that have been done in the US, for example, of looking at trends in drought severity over time. But we're now doing that on a global scale with the many, many different global regimes that brings into the equation. I hope to talk to you again in future about the Robin analysis when we finish that. We're looking to be talking about that in the next, hopefully by EGU next year, we'll be presenting the outcomes from this first analysis. But hopefully I've given you a sort of run through of where Robin comes from and what it's aiming to do today anyway. I'm now going to tell you a little bit more about the sort of community side and how you could potentially be involved in Robin. It's first of all worth sort of pausing on our timeline for Robin. And you can see up here that within the last year, we've sort of, we actually had to draw the line somewhere on bringing new stations and new countries into Robin. And so back in March last year, we made that the endpoint for our first effort to build a global data set. And we've since been working on the quality control, the analysis, and now the working towards publishing some results from Robin. But in parallel with all of that, we are now really already gearing up towards the phase 2 of Robin. So of course we had to draw a line somewhere to enable us to get on with publishing a data set and doing analysis. But at the same time, in parallel, we're looking to build partnerships to grow the network globally and hopefully start to fill in some of those white spaces. So the first thing I say is that anyone who is interested in participating in Robin, potentially bringing new data or new countries into Robin, we'd be delighted to hear from you as we go towards this phase 2 of expansion of the Robin network. One other thing that you can do with Robin is that we've developed a set of code libraries that are all available on GitHub. I should have put the link on here, but I can find that and send it around afterwards. But essentially, there is a whole series of code libraries that allow anyone to extract the same kind of drought and flow indicators that we're working with in Robin, and also to do the same kind of trend analysis that we're working on within Robin as we go forwards. So there's this great resource here that will allow the community to work with the Robin data sets, to work with the Robin data, and work as part of the Robin community in applying these kind of trend analyses on a global scale. The other thing to say about that is it allows some direct interfacing with other initiatives. So Caravan, for example, already has a series of data and code libraries about extracting metadata sets out there. So there's this huge resource that is going to be available to the community for common analysis. In terms of the community and the legacy, we're currently in this phase 2 of Robin going to be working with the IPCC, UNESCO and WMO in trying to take all of the learning that we've distilled out on what makes a reference network, try and develop webinars and tools to enable the user community to benefit from the understanding that is emerging from this global effort to pull together an international reference network. So we're actually committed to trying to develop a roadmap for the future evolution of reference networks in collaboration with other data initiatives like the Global Runoff Data Centre, pulling all of this together into a vision for how all this kind of work can be sustained going forwards on a long-term footing. So in summary, how do you get involved? Well, certainly, if you're interested, if you have potential stations or contacts to enable them to be defined in your country, we'd love to hear from you. If you want to learn about the reference network classification we've taken and how that's been applied in other countries, then Robin would be a good place to distill out some of our learning. Also, the Robin datasets will be there for the community to use, hopefully, published by the end of this year, datasets and tools to enable the community to analyze these data. And one thing I will say is this is not just useful for climate detection. For all sorts of other purposes, you need natural flow regimes. And I'll come up with a couple of examples briefly in a moment. And another way you can be involved is to use the Robin code libraries. So in short, please do use the Robin resources and spread the word amongst your networks. I think it's also worth just pausing on what I said there about other purposes. I've been focusing on detecting change, but quantifying natural regimes is really important for hydroecology. There's a really nice review paper that looks at flow naturalization. And one of the things it's constantly calling for in naturalizing river flows is finding neighboring catchments or upstream sites that are natural to allow data transfer and naturalization. So the Robin network could be really useful for that kind of thing. Another thing, I've mentioned this a few times already, but many people we're trying to sort of filter out the anthropogenic effects, but many people have, over the last decade, during the Panto-Ray initiative, there's been a whole initiative to try and actually detect the impacts of humans. One of the great things about these reference networks is you can use them as a kind of control to then look at impacts on flow regimes. And this is a really nice example out from the UK, which uses, from Saskia Sawe and others, which uses our benchmark network as a natural condition and then looks at a whole range of reservoir impacted catchments and uses hydrological signatures to try and understand the impacts of reservoirs on flow regimes. So tons of things that could be done with these kind of networks. I want to finish on a bit of a downer in a way, though, that a bit of a reality check rather than a downer. That Robin is, I think, hopefully you'll find it a great and useful thing for global scale analysis, but global analysis is challenging. Data quality, really, how much do we know about many of these records with the limited resources we have for quality control? Artificial influences are unfortunately a real barrier once you're looking on a global context. Many of those white spaces that are currently white spaces might be unfillable, if you like, because of the sheer scale and extent of human impacts on rivers. And land use and land cover change. We really, whilst we've tried to ask people we've tried to ask people submitting data to not give us catchments that have known major land use changes, and we've filtered out catchments that have a certain degree of urbanization. At the same time, rural land use changes can have a big impact on flow regimes. This is an example of some work I was part of, that led by Sergio Vicente Serrano, showing the impacts of land cover changes on some of the observed stream flow changes in Europe. And we simply don't have the information other than what we have asked people when we've asked for the data. We don't really have the full understanding of how land cover changes might have impacted these catchments. That's almost like a whole different level of problem. And finally, simply logistically, working with many different countries is fun and rewarding, but it is challenging, many different time zones and so on. So these are all some of the reality checks of this kind of work. From a really simple point of view in the UK as well, I just wanted to highlight that this quest for reliable hydrological data never ends. This is one of our benchmark catchments you can see here. And what I'm showing here on the right is that this is a catchment that's shown extreme flows in the drought last year, and it shows a really extreme downward trend in low flows. But recently, our data providers have raised suspicions about the recent flows, whether they're actually being measured accurately or whether artificial inferences might actually be having an effect in a catchment where we thought that they didn't. So this is just to highlight that even when you come up with a global data set, which is a challenge in itself, there are always going to be obstacles and barriers, and things change. Hydrometric data quality changes over time. Artificial inferences change. So you're always on your toes trying to understand. Even in the UK, where we have, we work with this data all the time, and we have this benchmark network, but there are still real challenges in how even when you think you've got a benchmark or reference catchment, that can change over time too. And so it never really ends. I'd like to finish with highlighting how people have been measuring flows, measuring levels for many centuries. These are nilometers from ancient Egypt, where people were measuring levels on the River Nile, even 2,000 years before Common Era, measuring levels as a way of trying to actually understand the likely flood extent, flood inundation on the River Nile. So hydrometry is as old as kind of civilization itself in a way. People have always been striving to try and take hydrological measurements. It never ends. The challenges just grow with time, but you do have to start somewhere. And Robin, if anything, of course it's a challenge. Of course there's a lot of difficulties in bringing the global community together, but you have to start somewhere. And we hope this is really a stepping stone to a truly long-term initiative to advance global hydrological variability detection. So thanks to all of those countries who are participating in Robin, and thanks to the funders. The countries are listed here, and thanks to all of them for their active participation in the Robin network. And thank you all for listening.